Victor Ashford was strangled backstage at a theatre in Providence while the audience watched him on stage, playing the ghost of the show. When they found his body, it was still warm, and the doctor said he had died only minutes earlier. Exactly at the time, dozens of people swore they had seen Victor in full costume under the lights. Other actors had shared the scene with him, and the crowd had applauded his every move. Before we go on, tell me in the comments which city and country you're listening from. It's always good to know where a case is traveling, because what happened that night in Providence broke every rule of common sense. How can a man be in two places at the same time? My name is Daniel Carter, and after more cases than I care to count, one thing has become clear. What seems impossible usually has a simple explanation, just not an obvious one at first glance. I was called to Providence on a cold March night in 1938 because something impossible had happened at the Riverside Theatre, and the local police had no idea where to start. The play was an ambitious production, the big opening of the spring season. Victor Ashford was the leading man, known for his talent on stage and his difficult temper off it, the kind that could turn rehearsals into a daily war. That night, he gave his final performance without knowing it. When they found his body backstage, he still had makeup on his face, and his costume lay tossed beside him, as if he had been caught off guard in the middle of changing. But the audience swore they had seen Victor on stage just minutes earlier, playing the ghost in a silver mask and long black cape that had become the trademark of the show's most dramatic scene. Something didn't add up. If Victor was dead backstage, who had the audience seen under the lights? 4 people had strong reasons to want Victor gone. Margaret Dane, the supporting actress, had been his lover for years and had recently learned he would never leave his wife. Thomas Harlow, the director, was being blackmailed by Victor over missing theatre funds. Evelyn Ashford, Victor's wife, knew about the affair and stood to gain a generous insurance payout from his death. And Peter Callahan, Victor's understudy, had lived in his shadow for years, waiting for a chance that never came, until that night. Any one of them could have wanted Victor dead, but none of them should have been able to put him in 2 places at once. Or could they? The Riverside Theatre smelled like old velvet and fresh paint that night, a mix that spoke of faded grandeur, trying to keep up appearances. I arrived around 11, an hour after they found Victor's body. The lobby was still lit like opening night, but the audience had been sent home. What remained was the quiet tension of people trying to act normal when nothing was normal anymore. A uniformed officer met me at the stage door and walked me through the narrow hallway behind the stage. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper that might have been elegant 20 years ago. Every few steps, there was a door with a name card pinned to it. Victor Ashford's dressing room was halfway down the hall, right next to Peter Callahan's. The walls looked thin enough that you could probably hear a conversation through them if you tried. Victor's dressing room was small and cramped. A mirror surrounded by light bulbs took up most of one wall, its surface smudged with powder and fingerprints. On the table beneath it lay brushes, makeup, and a few crumpled tissues. A wooden chair sat crooked in front of the mirror. On a rack to the side, costumes hung neatly. And on the floor, folded carefully to the side, was the ghost costume, the silver mask, the black cape, the loose white shirt. Victor himself was slumped against the back wall, eyes half open, head tilted to one side. Around his neck was a thin red line where the cord had dug in. His hands had scratches on them, defensive marks from trying to fight back. The coroner told me Victor had been dead no more than 15 minutes when they found him. That put the time of death right around 9:47, which was during the ghost scene. I asked the officer if anyone had heard anything. He shook his head. The play was loud, he said. Music, voices, the audience laughing and clapping. Back here, behind closed doors and thick curtains, a man could die without anyone noticing. But that wasn't what bothered me most. What bothered me was that Victor was supposed to be on stage when he died, and according to everyone I'd spoken to so far, he was. They had all seen the ghost in the silver mask and black cape, moving slowly across the stage exactly as the script called for. I left the dressing room and asked the officer to take me to the stage. I needed to understand the layout. The main stage was larger than I expected, framed by heavy red curtains that still hung half open. The backdrop was painted to look like an old mansion. Behind it, there was a narrow space where actors could move without being seen by the audience. The stage manager explained that in the ghost scene, the actor entered from stage left, crossed slowly along the back, and exited stage right. The whole thing lasted about 4 minutes. 4 minutes. That was all the time someone had to kill Victor, put on his costume and take his place on stage. It sounded impossible, but standing there in the empty theatre, looking at the stage from where the audience would have sat, I started to see how it could work. The silver mask covered the entire face. The cape was oversized and hid the body shape. The lighting was dim. The movements were slow and rehearsed. From the audience's perspective, it would have been impossible to see the actor's face clearly. All they would see was a tall figure in a mask and cape, moving the way the ghost always moved. If someone had the same height and build as Victor and knew the blocking of the scene, they could walk across that stage and no one would know the difference. I stood there for a moment, letting the space settle in my mind. The empty theatre, the quiet stage, the idea of a man being cheered by a crowd while already dead a few feet away. Someone in this building had the chance to kill Victor and still put a ghost on that stage. I just didn't know yet who had both the opportunity and the nerve to pull it off. The first person I wanted to talk to was Peter Callahan, Victor's understudy. The officer told me Peter was still in his dressing room, waiting like the rest of them. I walked back down the narrow hallway and knocked on the door next to Victor's. A voice told me to come in. Peter was sitting in front of his mirror, still in stage makeup, though half of it had been wiped away. He was younger than I expected, maybe late 20s, with the kind of lean build that could pass for Victor's silhouette under the right lighting. His hands were resting on the table, and I noticed faint red marks across the palms, like rope burns or pressure lines from gripping something hard. He looked up when I entered and offered a tired smile that didn't reach his eyes. I introduced myself and asked how he was holding up. He said he didn't know yet, that it hadn't really sunk in. His voice was hoarse, rougher than I expected for someone his age. He noticed me noticing and explained that his throat always gave him trouble during runs. That's why he kept throat lozenges on him all the time. He pulled a small tin from his pocket and offered me one. I declined. I asked him where he had been during the ghost scene. He said he was in the wings, stage right, waiting for his cue for a scene that came later. He wasn't supposed to be anywhere near Victor's dressing room. When I asked if he had seen anyone unusual back there, anyone who shouldn't have been, he shook his head. Everyone had been focused on their own entrances and exits. Backstage during a show was organized chaos, he said, and you learned not to notice things that weren't your business. I asked about the marks on his hands. He glanced down at them, almost surprised, and said he had helped move some of the heavier set pieces earlier in the day. The ropes had been rough, and he hadn't worn gloves. It happened sometimes. He flexed his fingers, as if to prove they still worked, then let them drop back to the table. He didn't seem nervous exactly, but there was something else there, a kind of exhaustion that went beyond the long night. I asked how long he had been Victor's understudy. 3 years, he said. 3 years of watching from the wings, learning every line, every gesture, every pause, and never once getting the chance to do it in front of a real audience. Until tonight, maybe, if the producers decided the show could go on. I asked him what Victor had been like to work with. Peter leaned back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Victor was talented, he said. No one could argue with that. But he was also difficult. He treated the crew like furniture and the other actors like props. If you made a mistake during rehearsal, Victor would let you know in front of everyone, and if you did something well, he wouldn't say anything at all. Peter said it flatly, without anger, like he was describing the weather. I asked if he had seen Victor before the ghost scene. Peter nodded. Victor had passed him in the hallway maybe 10 minutes before his entrance, muttering something under his breath about the lighting being too dim. That was the last time Peter saw him alive. After that, Peter had gone to his position in the wings and stayed there until someone came running to say Victor was dead. Before I left, I asked Peter one more question. Did he think anyone in the company had wanted Victor gone badly enough to kill him? He looked at me for a long moment, then said that half the people in the building had probably imagined it at some point. Victor had a gift for making enemies, but imagining something and doing it were two very different things. I thanked him and stepped back into the hallway. Peter stayed where he was, staring at his reflection in the mirror. As I closed the door, I caught a glimpse of his face in the glass. He looked like a man who had spent years waiting for something, and now that it had finally arrived, he wasn't sure what to do with it. Margaret Dane's dressing room was at the end of the hall, larger than the others and decorated with more care. There were flowers in a vase on the table, photographs pinned to the walls, and a silk robe hanging on a hook by the door. She was sitting in front of her mirror when I knocked, removing what was left of her stage makeup with slow, deliberate strokes. She looked up when I entered and gestured for me to sit in the chair by the door. Her face was pale beneath the makeup, and her eyes had the kind of redness that came from either crying or holding back tears for too long. She asked if I wanted tea. There was a small electric kettle in the corner, still warm. I said no, but thanked her anyway. I told her I needed to understand what had happened tonight, and that meant talking to everyone who had been close to Victor. She nodded slowly, like she had been expecting this conversation. She said she and Victor had worked together for years, that they had been close once and that things had changed. She didn't elaborate and I didn't push. Not yet. I asked where she had been during the ghost scene. She said she had been on stage for the scene just before it, playing opposite another actor in what was supposed to be a dramatic confrontation. She had exited stage left and gone straight to her dressing room to change costumes for a scene that came later. Her dresser could confirm that, she said. The woman had been with her the entire time, helping with buttons and pins. Margaret's hands were resting on the table, and I noticed she was wearing black silk gloves. It was warm in the theatre, warmer than it should have been with all the lights and bodies, but she kept the gloves on. When I asked about them, she smiled faintly and said her hands got cold easily, even in summer. It was a circulation problem, she said, nothing serious. She had learned to live with it. On the table next to her makeup kit was a cigarette case, silver with an engraved pattern on the lid. A few cigarettes were visible inside, each with a distinctive gold filter. I asked if she smoked often. She said she did, that it helped with the nerves before a performance. She opened the case and offered me one. I declined. She took one for herself but didn't light it, just held it between her gloved fingers. I asked her what Victor had been like in the hours before the show. She said he had been the same as always, focused, demanding, impossible to please. He had complained about the lighting during the final rehearsal that afternoon, snapped at the stage manager, and made one of the younger actors cry. Margaret said it without emotion, like she was reciting a grocery list. Victor had always been that way, she said. You either learned to ignore it or you didn't last long in his productions. I asked if she knew of anyone who might have wanted to hurt him. She was quiet for a moment, turning the unlit cigarette between her fingers. Then she said that Victor had a talent for making people feel small. He collected grievances the way some people collected awards, but wanting someone gone and actually doing something about it were different things, she said. Most people just learned to stay out of his way. Before I left, I asked one more question. Had she seen Victor after the show started? She shook her head. Once the curtain went up, everyone stayed in their own orbits. She had been focused on her scenes, her costume changes, her cues. She hadn't seen Victor at all after the play began. The next time she heard his name, it was because someone was shouting that he was dead. I thanked her and stood to leave. As I reached the door, I glanced back. Margaret was still sitting in front of her mirror, the cigarette unlit in her gloved hand, staring at her own reflection like she was trying to recognize the woman looking back at her. The next person I needed to speak with was Thomas Harlow, the director. I found him in the small office near the front of the theatre, sitting behind a desk stacked with scripts, invoices, and what looked like weeks of unopened mail. He was older than the others, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of tired eyes that came from too many late nights and not enough sleep. He stood when I entered and shook my hand with a grip that was firm but distracted. He apologized for the mess and gestured to a chair that had a coat draped over it. I moved the coat and sat down. He asked if I wanted coffee. I said no. He poured himself a cup anyway, more out of habit than need, and sat back down across from me. I asked him to walk me through the evening, starting from when the show began. He said he had been in the house for most of the performance, sitting near the back so he could see the full stage without being noticed by the audience. Directors always watched from the back, he said. It gave you the best sense of how everything looked from the cheap seats. He had watched the first act, made a few mental notes about pacing, and stayed in his seat until intermission. During intermission, he had gone backstage briefly to check on a lighting issue that one of the stagehands had mentioned earlier. He spoke to the stage manager, confirmed the problem was fixed, and then returned to his seat before the second act began. He was sitting in the same spot when the ghost scene happened. He saw the figure cross the stage, just like it was supposed to. He had no reason to think anything was wrong until someone came running down the aisle to tell him Victor was dead. I asked if he had spoken to Victor earlier in the day. Thomas nodded and said they had argued during the final rehearsal that afternoon. Victor had been furious about the lighting cues, said they were making him look washed out on stage. Thomas had tried to explain that the lighting was designed for atmosphere, not vanity, and Victor had responded by threatening to walk out. It was the kind of argument they had regularly, Thomas said. Victor liked to make threats. He rarely followed through. I asked what Victor had been threatening him with specifically. Thomas looked down at his coffee cup and was quiet for a moment. Then he said that Victor had accused him of mishandling theatre funds, of taking money that should have gone into production costs and using it for personal expenses. It wasn't true, Thomas said, but Victor didn't care about the truth. He cared about leverage. I asked if Victor had proof of these accusations. Thomas shook his head and said there was no proof because there was nothing to prove. The theatre's finances were tight, like they always were, but everything was accounted for. Victor just liked to imply things to make people nervous. It was part of how he controlled a room. I shifted the conversation and asked about the layout of the backstage area, specifically about the ghost costume. Thomas explained that they always kept 2 versions of important costumes in case of damage or emergency. The ghost costume was no exception. One was kept in Victor's dressing room ready for his entrance. The other was stored in the costume shop at the back of the building, along with all the other backup pieces. I asked who would have had access to the second costume. Thomas said anyone in the company could have accessed it if they wanted to. The costume shop wasn't locked during performances. People went in and out all the time to grab props or fix tears in fabric. It wasn't the kind of place anyone paid much attention to. Before I left, I asked Thomas if he thought Victor's death was personal or practical. He looked at me like he didn't understand the question, so I clarified. Did someone kill Victor because they hated him, or because his death solved a problem? Thomas leaned back in his chair and thought about it. Then he said that with Victor, those 2 things were usually the same. I spent the next hour talking to stagehands, makeup artists, and minor actors who had been scattered throughout the building during the performance. Most of them had seen nothing unusual. A few remembered hearing raised voices earlier in the day, but that was normal when Victor was involved. No one had noticed anyone going into Victor's dressing room during the ghost scene. No one had seen anything that didn't belong, but one of the lighting technicians mentioned something that stuck with me. He said that during the dress rehearsal the day before, there had been a problem with one of the curtain mechanisms. It had jammed in the middle of a scene change and stayed stuck for about 15 minutes while they worked to fix it. The curtain had been frozen in the exact position it would have been during the ghost scene the following night. He thought it was just an annoying coincidence at the time. I asked him who had been backstage during those 15 minutes. He shrugged and said it was a rehearsal, so most of the cast had been around. People used the downtime to run lines, adjust costumes, or just sit and wait. He couldn't say for certain who had been where. Rehearsals were loose that way. People moved around. After that, I went back to the hallway where the dressing rooms were and examined Victor's room more carefully. The ghost costume that had been on the floor earlier was now bagged as evidence, but I had seen enough of it to know what I was looking for. The mask was plain silver, smooth and featureless except for the eye holes. The cape was heavy fabric, black on the outside and lined with dark grey on the inside. The shirt was loose-fitting, meant to hang off the body and hide its shape. I crouched down near where the costume had been and noticed something I hadn't seen before. There were faint water stains on the floor, small circular marks that looked like they had come from drips. The floor was wood, old and uneven, and the stains had soaked in slightly. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either, maybe a few hours at most. I asked one of the officers if anyone had spilled something in the dressing room earlier. He checked his notes and said no. The room had been exactly as they found it when they arrived. Nothing had been moved or cleaned. The stains had been there when they sealed the room. I stood and looked around the small space again. A mirror, a table, a chair, a rack of costumes. Everything had its place, but something felt off, like a picture frame hanging just slightly crooked. You couldn't point to what was wrong, but you knew something wasn't quite right. I left Victor's room and walked back toward the stage. On my way, I passed Peter's dressing room again. The door was slightly open, and I could hear him inside, talking to someone in a low voice. I paused for a moment, not to eavesdrop exactly, but to listen to the tone. It sounded like he was trying to calm someone down, reassure them. The conversation stopped abruptly, and I kept walking. Near the stage entrance, I found a stagehand carrying a box of props. I asked him if anyone had access to Victor's dressing room during the show. He said that technically anyone with a key could get in, but most people didn't have keys to other actors' rooms. Victor kept his locked when he wasn't inside. He was protective of his space, didn't like people touching his things. I asked if the room had been locked when they found the body. The stagehand thought about it, then said he didn't think so. The door had been closed, but not locked. Someone must have opened it from the inside before Victor died, or the killer had a key. Either way, it meant Victor had let someone in or someone had taken the key from him after. I decided it was time to talk to Evelyn Ashford, Victor's wife. She had arrived at the theatre shortly after the body was discovered, and from what I had been told, she was still in the director's office, waiting to be interviewed. When I entered, she was sitting in the same chair I had occupied earlier, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her face composed in a way that suggested either deep shock or careful control. She looked up when I came in and offered a small, polite nod. I introduced myself and expressed my condolences. She thanked me quietly and said she was still trying to process what had happened. Her voice was steady, but there was a tightness to it, like she was holding something back with effort. I asked when she had arrived at the theatre that evening. She said she had come late just before the second act began. She had been at home with her sister earlier, dealing with a personal matter that had taken longer than expected and had lost track of time. By the time she realized how late it was, the play had already started. She slipped into a seat at the back and watched the rest of the performance from there. I asked if anyone could confirm she had been with her sister earlier. She nodded and said her sister lived nearby and would be happy to verify the timeline. They had been together for most of the afternoon and early evening. Evelyn had only left the house around 9, which barely gave her enough time to reach the theatre before the second act. I shifted the conversation and asked about her relationship with Victor. She was quiet for a moment, looking down at her hands. Then she said that their marriage had been difficult for some time. Victor was consumed by his work, she said, and there wasn't much room left for anything else. She had learned to live with it, or at least she thought she had. I asked if she knew about Victor's involvement with Margaret Dane. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. She said she had known for a while. It wasn't the first time Victor had strayed, and she doubted it would have been the last. She had considered leaving him more than once, but the logistics of a divorce were complicated, and Victor had made it clear he wouldn't make things easy. I asked if there had been any life insurance policies on Victor. She said there had been, a modest policy that would cover funeral expenses and provide some security for a few months. Nothing extravagant. Victor had always been more concerned with his legacy than his finances. Before I moved on, I asked Evelyn if she had gone backstage at any point during the performance. She shook her head and said she had stayed in her seat the entire time. She hadn't wanted to distract Victor or create any awkwardness by appearing unannounced. The last thing she wanted was to give him another reason to be upset. I thanked her for her time and stood to leave. As I reached the door, she spoke again, her voice softer than before. She said that Victor had been many things: talented, ambitious, cruel, but he had also been her husband. Whatever he had done, whatever mistakes he had made, he hadn't deserved to die like that. There was something in the way she said it that made me pause, something that felt genuine beneath the careful composure. I left her sitting in the office and walked back toward the stage. The building was quieter now, most of the cast and crew having been sent home for the night. Only a few officers remained, along with the people who had been asked to stay for questioning. The theatre felt different in the silence, less like a place of performance and more like a hollow shell waiting to be filled again. By midnight, I had spoken to most of the key players, but I still didn't have a clear picture of how the crime had been executed. The pieces were there, scattered across the theatre like props, waiting to be assembled into a coherent scene. I decided to walk through the backstage area one more time, retracing the path the ghost would have taken from entrance to exit. I started at stage left, where the actor playing the ghost was supposed to enter. The entrance was hidden behind a heavy velvet curtain that could be pulled aside quickly and quietly. From there, the stage opened up into a wide space with the painted backdrop behind it. The ghost's path was simple. Enter, walk slowly across the back of the stage, pause briefly in the center for dramatic effect, Then exit stage right. I walked the path myself, counting my steps and timing the movement. At a slow, deliberate pace, it took just under 4 minutes. That matched what the stage manager had told me earlier. 4 minutes for the ghost to appear, cross, and disappear. 4 minutes during which Victor was being killed in his dressing room. As I reached the exit point at stage right, I noticed something I hadn't paid attention to before. There was a narrow corridor that ran directly from the stage exit to the hallway where the dressing rooms were located. It was a service corridor, barely wide enough for one person, designed to let actors move quickly between the stage and their rooms without being seen by the audience. If someone knew the layout well, they could make that trip in less than a minute. I walked down the corridor and emerged right next to Peter's dressing room. Victor's door was only a few steps beyond that. The proximity was striking. Someone could leave the stage, strip off a costume in seconds, and be back in their room before anyone noticed they were gone. I turned back and walked the corridor again, this time looking at the walls and floor more carefully. There were scuff marks on the floor near the stage exit, the kind that came from hurried movement. The walls had faint smudges at shoulder height, like someone had brushed against them while moving quickly. None of it proved anything, but it painted a picture of rushed activity in a space that was usually empty during performances. I returned to the stage and stood in the center, looking out at the empty seats. From this angle, with the stage lights off, I could see all the way to the back of the house. During a performance with the lights on, the actors wouldn't be able to see past the first few rows. The audience would be a wall of darkness. Anyone sitting out there would see only what the lights showed them, a figure in a costume moving through a scene. I thought about the dress rehearsal and the curtain that had jammed for 15 minutes. The technician had said it happened during the ghost scene, or at least during the timing of that scene. 15 minutes was more than enough time to walk the path multiple times, to practice the movements, to memorize every step. If someone had used that time to rehearse their own version of the scene, no one would have thought twice about it. Rehearsals were full of people moving around, testing positions, working out timing. I walked back to the dressing room hallway and stopped outside Peter's door. I could hear movement inside, the sound of someone packing things into a bag or box. I knocked, and Peter opened the door after a moment. He looked tired, more tired than he had earlier, and there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not fear exactly, but wariness, like he was waiting for something to happen. I asked him if he had walked the ghost scene during the dress rehearsal the day before, during the time when the curtain was stuck. He hesitated, just for a second, then said he might have. He couldn't remember exactly. There had been a lot of downtime during that rehearsal, and he had used it to practice different scenes, get a feel for the stage. It was what understudies did. They prepared for moments that might never come. I left Peter's dressing room and made my way back to the small office where I had set up a temporary workspace. The theatre was nearly empty now, just a few officers finishing their reports and a custodian sweeping the lobby with slow, methodical strokes. I sat down with my notes and started arranging everything I had learned into some kind of order, looking for the pattern beneath the chaos. Victor had been killed during the ghost scene, sometime between 9:45 and 9:50. The ghost had appeared on stage during that exact window, which meant someone had taken Victor's place while he was being murdered. That someone had to know the blocking, had to have the right build, and had to have access to a second costume. The list of people who fit all three criteria was short. Peter was the obvious candidate. He was Victor's understudy, which meant he knew every movement of every scene by heart. He had the same height and build, nearly identical from a distance, and he had admitted to practicing on stage during the dress rehearsal when the curtain jammed, giving him time to work out the timing. But knowing someone could have done something and proving they actually did were two very different problems. Then there was the question of motive. Peter had lived in Victor's shadow for 3 years, watching and waiting for a chance that never came. That kind of frustration could build into something darker over time, especially if there was pressure or encouragement from somewhere else. I thought about the conversation I had overheard earlier, Peter talking to someone in a low, reassuring voice. Who had he been talking to, and what had they been discussing that required such careful privacy? Margaret Dane kept coming back to my mind. She had motive. She had been close to Victor for years, and she had the kind of controlled composure that came from either complete innocence or very careful planning. The black gloves she wore all night still bothered me. She said her hands were cold, but the theatre was warm, almost uncomfortably so with all the lights and bodies. Gloves could hide a lot of things, scratches, bruises, marks from handling rope or struggling with someone. And then there were the cigarettes with the gold filters. Margaret smoked them constantly, always had a silver case nearby with a few tucked inside. I thought about Peter and his throat lozenges, the ones he said he needed for his voice. He had offered me one earlier, pulled the tin from his pocket without hesitation. It was such a casual gesture, the kind of thing you did without thinking when something was always with you. I stood and walked back down the hallway to Margaret's dressing room. The door was closed, but I could see light underneath. I knocked, and she told me to come in. She was still there, sitting in the same position as before, though her makeup was completely gone now. She looked older without it, more worn, like the performance had taken something out of her that wouldn't come back easily. I asked her if she smoked often during performances. She said she did, whenever she had a moment off stage. It helped with the nerves, kept her hands steady before an entrance. I asked if anyone else in the cast borrowed her cigarettes. She thought about it for a moment, then said that Peter sometimes did. He didn't buy his own because he didn't like people knowing he smoked. He worried it would affect his voice, damage his reputation as someone serious about the craft, or at least that's what he told her. I asked when she had last seen Peter that evening. She said she had run into him briefly during intermission, backstage near the costume shop. They had talked for a minute, nothing important, just the usual pre-show anxiety and small reassurances actors gave each other. He had seemed more nervous than usual, she said, but that wasn't surprising given the circumstances. Opening nights made everyone tense, even people who had been doing this for years. I thanked her and left the room. As I walked back toward the stage, I thought about what she had said. Peter and Margaret had been near the costume shop during intermission, the costume shop where the second ghost costume was stored, unlocked and accessible to anyone who knew where to look. It could have been a coincidence, two people crossing paths in a busy theatre. But I had stopped believing in coincidences hours ago. I spent the next hour going through the physical evidence one more time, looking for anything I might have missed. The ghost costume that had been found in Victor's dressing room was still bagged and tagged, but I asked to see it again. The officer brought it to me in the office, and I laid each piece out on the desk carefully. The silver mask was smooth and cold to the touch, with two oval eye holes and nothing else. Inside, along the edge where it would rest against the wearer's face, there was a faint smudge of color. I looked closer and saw it was lipstick, red and distinct. Victor didn't wear lipstick. Someone else had worn this mask, someone who had been in makeup for a performance. The cape was heavy, made of thick black fabric with a grey silk lining. I ran my hands over it, checking the seams and hems for anything unusual. Near the collar, I found a single strand of hair, darker than Victor's, caught in the fabric. It wasn't much, but it was something. I asked the officer to make sure it was catalogued properly. The white shirt was loose and oversized, designed to hang off the body and obscure its shape. There were no stains, no tears, nothing that stood out. But when I held it up to the light, I noticed something. The fabric around the collar had faint creases, like it had been folded tightly and then smoothed out quickly. It wasn't the way you'd handle a costume if you were putting it on normally. It was the way you'd handle it if you were in a hurry. I set the costume aside and thought about the timeline again. Victor had been killed between 9:45 and 9:50. The ghost scene lasted 4 minutes, starting around 9:48. That meant the killer had roughly 3 minutes to strangle Victor, change into the costume and get to the stage entrance. It was tight, but it was possible if everything had been planned down to the second. Peter could have done it physically. He was strong enough, fast enough, and he knew the layout of the theatre better than anyone except maybe the stage crew. But could he have done it alone? The more I thought about it, the less likely it seemed. Strangling someone wasn't quick or easy, especially if the victim fought back. Victor had scratches on his hands, which meant he had tried to defend himself. That took time, and time was the one thing the killer didn't have. Unless there were two people, one to hold Victor down, one to finish the job, one to take the stage, one to create the alibi. It would explain how everything happened so quickly, how the timing worked out so perfectly. But it also meant the conspiracy was deeper than I had first thought. I walked back to the stage one more time and stood in the center looking out at the empty house. The lights were off now, and the theater was dark except for a few work lights along the edges. From where I stood, I could barely see the back row. During a performance with the stage lights blazing, I wouldn't have been able to see anything past the first few rows. The audience would be invisible, just a mass of darkness beyond the light. That was the key, I realized. The ghost scene wasn't about who was on stage, it was about what the audience believed they were seeing. The mask, the cape, the dim lighting, the familiar movements, all of it was designed to make people see what they expected to see. And if someone knew that, if someone understood how perception worked in a theater, they could use it. I left the stage and walked back toward the dressing rooms one final time. Peter's door was closed now, no light underneath. Margaret's door was the same. The hallway was quiet, empty, waiting. Somewhere in this building, two people had made a decision to take a life. They had planned it carefully, executed it precisely, and almost gotten away with it. Almost. I called everyone back to the theater early the next morning. Peter, Margaret, Thomas, Evelyn, and a few of the crew members gathered on the stage, tired and unsure why I had asked them to return. I stood in front of them and began with the truth I had pieced together. Victor Ashford hadn't been killed by one person acting alone. He had been killed by two people working together in careful conspiracy. Peter Callahan and Margaret Dane had been partners in this from the beginning. They had been involved secretly for weeks, meeting backstage when no one was paying attention, sharing cigarettes and building trust. Margaret smoked expensive brands with gold filters, distinctive ones she kept in a silver case. Peter borrowed them regularly but hid the habit behind throat lozenges, telling everyone he needed to protect his voice. The lozenges masked the smell. That small, seemingly innocent connection was what tied them together. Margaret had the emotional motive. Victor had promised years ago to leave his wife for her, and he never did. When she discovered he was involved with someone else, someone younger, the sense of betrayal became too much to bear. But Margaret couldn't act alone. She needed to be visible, performing on stage in full view of the audience, creating an ironclad alibi while the murder took place. She needed someone with access, skill, and his own reasons to want Victor gone. Peter had those reasons. 3 years as Victor's understudy, learning every line, every gesture, every movement, and never once getting the chance to perform them for a real audience. Margaret offered him everything he wanted: the lead role, recognition, and a future where he wouldn't live in Victor's shadow anymore. Together, they created a plan built on precise timing, misdirection, and the thing theaters do best: creating illusions. During the dress rehearsal the day before, when the curtain mechanism jammed for 15 minutes, Peter used the downtime to practice. He walked the ghost scene over and over, memorizing every step and pause. No one questioned it. That's what understudies did. During intermission on opening night, Peter and Margaret met near the costume shop and retrieved the second ghost costume, the backup kept for emergencies. They hid it in Peter's dressing room, which sat right next door to Victor's. When the moment arrived, Margaret went on stage for her scene, visible to hundreds of people. While she performed under the lights, Peter entered Victor's dressing room next door. Victor was preparing for the ghost scene. Distracted, Peter came from behind and used a thin cord to strangle him. Victor fought back. His scratched hands showed that, but Peter was younger and stronger. The rope marks on Peter's own hands, which he'd claimed came from moving set pieces, were actually from gripping the cord tightly during the struggle. Once Victor was dead, Peter moved fast. He dressed in the hidden ghost costume, secured the silver mask over his face, and slipped through the narrow service corridor connecting the dressing rooms to the stage. He entered exactly on cue. The audience saw a tall figure in a mask and cape, moving slowly under dim lighting. They saw the ghost. They thought they saw Victor. After the 4-minute scene, Peter exited and used the corridor to return to his dressing room. He stripped off the costume and hid it. In his rush and adrenaline, he wet his hands to cool down. Those were the water stains found in Victor's room later. When the body was discovered, Peter acted shocked and cooperative. The lipstick smudge inside the mask exposed them. Before Peter went to kill Victor, Margaret had kissed him for luck. The lipstick transferred when he put on the mask. The dark hair caught in the cape was Peter's, not Victor's. The creased collar showed the costume had been hidden hastily, not stored properly. Peter looked at the floor when I finished. Margaret stared straight ahead, composed as ever. Neither denied it. They had planned everything except the small human details that betrayed them: a lipstick mark, a borrowed cigarette, a strand of hair, a water stain. Victor Ashford had been difficult and cruel, but he hadn't deserved to die while an audience applauded a ghost he would never play again. They arrested Peter and Margaret that morning, and the Riverside Theatre closed for the rest of the season. The cast dispersed, the sets came down, and the building went dark. I left Providence the next day with the case resolved, but the weight of it still present. What stayed with me wasn't the cleverness of the timing or the precision of their planning. It was how two capable people had convinced themselves that murder could solve disappointment and betrayal. Peter wanted the recognition he felt he deserved. Margaret wanted revenge for years of broken promises. Together they created an illusion more elaborate than any scene they had performed, and it still collapsed when examined closely. Theatres are built on making audiences see what isn't really there. The lighting, the costumes, the distance between stage and seats, all of it works together to create belief. But illusions only hold when nobody looks past the surface. The moment you start noticing the details, the lipstick on a mask, the borrowed cigarette, the water stain on a floor, the trick falls apart. In the end, mystery never survives when you look with calm enough. If you enjoyed this story, leave a like and tell me in the comments what you thought of this mystery. And stay tuned for the next case. I guarantee it'll be even more intriguing.